I've got a bunch of iPhone 7 Pluses that have problems. Two of them appear to be charging ICs. You can see there is no amperage being drawn through the charge port here. So we're going to go ahead and replace that chip. And to do so, start by heating up the corner here. And you can see there's kind of a notch in the shielding. If you're lucky, you might be able to grab a hold of this with a pair of tweezers. I am usually not very lucky on camera, so I struggled with this one for a second. But if we pull this back, we don't even really have to remove the sticker completely. You can kind of just fold it over and then grab a piece of tape or a weight or something else that will hold it in place so that doesn't get into your way. And I am going to have to reposition the camera here in just a second. So we'll just kind of edit this so you don't have to be bored with it. There is our heat sink that we're going to set right on top of the NAND there so that doesn't get too hot. Hopefully that is the idea. As you can see, it's kind of tucked underneath the shielding, but not so badly that we can't reach it. So if you've got a pair of tweezers and you can come straight up with this, you should be able to get it out. Of course, we're not going to put a lot of tension on it. I'm going to wait until it moves freely left to right, and then I'll go ahead and lift it out. And it's a little hard to explain that. So you definitely want to get some hands-on experience before you try these, because a few things can go wrong here. But usually we're looking at about 30 seconds or so worth of direct heat. And I want to say that mine is set around 380-ish, but that's going to vary, of course, depending on your hot air station. But as soon as we see that the solder begins to liquefy here, and as I mentioned, if you just kind of bump this thing, you'll see that it's moving left and right. And at that point, we'll know that it's warm enough, and we can go ahead and just kind of lift straight up and then move it over to the side, because as I mentioned, it is kind of just tucked in there so that that first row on the left-hand side isn't visible once you get this thing out. All right, so you can see these come off pretty clean, and of course the question is always to tin or not to tin, whether or not to use wick and so forth, and I'll kind of leave that up to whoever's doing the repair. I'm kind of conflicted on this because you don't want to overwork these pads. At the same time, you don't want oxidation on your solder, but to go in here and try to remove the old solder seems to be like a bit more risk than necessary. Now, I've edited in another removal just so you can kind of see this from a different angle. There are a few different ways that you can approach this. Of course, we always want to have our heat sink sitting on top of the NAND there. That does not tolerate a whole lot of heat. Just remember to remove the coin as soon as you remove the chip. Again, just kind of coming in at a slightly different angle here. I've almost got the air straight up and down, but it should radiate enough and blow up underneath there so that we can get all of this thing heated evenly. And this will just take a couple of seconds again where it will start to move, and then we can lift it out. One thing that I did notice is that the balls underneath the chip tend to look similar a lot of times when you pull them off. So this is interesting to me. I would imagine because we've got a couple ground pads in there that require a bit more heat, and I've seen people make videos where they lift these off and they claim that the balls are split in half and you don't have to re-tin it, you don't have to re-ball it. Again, that kind of depends on your preference. I'm not really convinced whether or not the risk outweighs the benefit. So I am going to go ahead and tin these. That is my preference. I'll add some flux on here, and the tricky thing of course is going to be getting underneath that little rail, or the shield rather, the metal piece on the right hand side that you're looking at now. So you've got to have a soldering iron with a very small tip in order to get underneath there. The micro tweezers work, and I'm sure that there are other options that will work, you know, assuming that you want to tin these things, which I really think is the best idea. But again, I've seen it done without, and the phones still work. Haven't heard about them coming back for any problems afterwards, so you know, we'll see, I guess. But on mine, I do prefer to tin them. I don't like the idea of wicking these. I don't think that it's necessary, really. As long as we go over and hit each one of these enough to burn off the oxidation, and then, of course, you know, once you clean it, you're going to have a certain amount of oxidation, and I would assume that when we add the new chip with new solder balls on it, because we have flux at that point and we're raising it up to a sufficient temperature to have the solder run together, that seems like it would eliminate the oxidation, but I really don't know. I'm certainly not a scientist, so maybe you can ask one and they can tell us, you know, how that works exactly. But the whole idea here is that if you reach a sufficient temperature to melt the lead and it makes contact with the other surface, if you've got sufficient flux, it seems like we should be able to eliminate that oxidation and not have to worry about it. That's my impression. Anyhow, once you get these balls nice and level, that's really the important thing. We want to have them, you know, have the IC kind of sitting flat so that it's easy enough to center. That's always my challenge. And you can see I'm kind of getting up underneath here. So if you look at it at an angle, I know it's hard to see on here. It's kind of difficult to record this under a microscope. I'm actually holding the board by hand right now so you can see the angle. So I need to come up with a better method of recording that, but I think you get the idea. So we'll get these all tinned, and then we can go ahead and install our chip. And I will cut out the part where I struggle to center that thing because it's never a lot of fun. It usually takes me a minute or so to get this aligned to about where I need it to be. And of course, if you've got some flux under there, especially if it's tacky, it will kind of stay in place to a certain extent, but some of these like to slide off. And if the balls aren't even, obviously that's going to be a problem. So assuming everything is nice and lined up the way you want it to be, we can go ahead and come in a little slow with the heat here so that the flux starts to melt, and that kind of helps. You don't want to come in here with a big blast of air and knock this thing out of position, because then you get to start all over again. And if you get it so hot that the solder is actually melting and then you knock it out of position, well, you get to go back and clean it up and reball the chip and just add a lot of time really to the process. So I'm going to try to avoid that. And of course, what we're looking for here is for the flux to boil, and at some point you should see the chip just kind of shift and lay down a little bit right there. Hopefully you saw I gave it a little nudge to make sure that the solder underneath was liquefied, and it pulled off to the side, and then it recentered itself because of the surface tension. So we've got a nice straight alignment on there. And if you look at this from an angle, again, I know it's hard to see because I can't get the lighting right when I zoom in on this thing for some reason, but you can actually see some of the balls from the side and confirm that they are attached to the right spot. And then of course we'll go in here and clean up all of this flux from the outside. Yes, I know it's no clean, but I believe it's much better practice to make sure that you get this all cleaned off anyways, even though they say you don't have to clean it. Rubbing alcohol and some warm air will make this process a lot easier. Once it cools down, it's difficult to get this stuff to come off with just rubbing alcohol. If you have a horsehair brush or a toothbrush, those can be helpful as well. Again, you want to kind of preheat the board, brush it off, and then if you hit it with some warm air, it doesn't have to be the hot air that we're using to install the chip. Something around 150°C, that'll dry it up and keep everything liquefied, so you can just brush it a little more if there's anything left over. All right, so let's plug it in and see what's happening here. And I know it's hard to see, but the battery is actually charging, so I'm going to go ahead and leave this on the charger for a few minutes. You can see it's pulling amperage at a high rate because the battery is empty at this point. We'll come back here and check on it in a minute. And there we go. We have a charging phone that turns on, and it's already made it up to 8%.
If you found the video helpful, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and check out our weekly Tech Talk live stream. Have a great one, and thanks for watching.